Welcome to Beware of Spoilers. I am Adam. I am just seeing Who We Are, Chronicle of Racism in America. And I am currently in my car on my way back eating M&Ms. So there are abrupt pauses and changes in that regard. Please see the above-mentioned M&Ms as a cause for that. So, now when it comes to documentaries, and I know I'm going to get shit for this, because this is my opinion on documentaries, and I know it's a vast oversimplification, but this is how I view documentaries. There are two types of a documentary. The narrative documentary versus the thesis documentary. A narrative documentary is kind of like Flea, which is a documentary designed to create a narrative about what happened over the course of the movie that's going to tell you, like a summary of events almost. Like watching a news special. Like when you watch the news, it's like, here's what happened, then this happened, and this happened, then boom, we're done. The thesis documentary is kind of like when you were in high school and you had to write a paper about something. Like if you're from New York, you have the Regents exam, and when you take the Regents for the U.S. history, there's, two essays you gotta write. And one's gonna be an essay about, like a DBQ, and then the other one's gonna be take two things and compare them for U.S. history. And the one that my teacher used to use as the example of, the perfect one is, take two pieces of technology and talk about how much they impacted American history. And he said that that's the perfect one because basically the magic is right on the page, write anything. And when they grade these, they don't grade them based on how historically... there is still some historical accuracy that you need to have. You can't just blindly make claims unassisted. But the point is, you have to be able to come up with a thesis, back up your thesis with evidence, and then, have it all wrapped up in a succinct way that makes sense to the reader, assuming the reader has never read the topic before. And that's, two different things, where it's like you're either trying to prove a thesis or tell a story, is basically what I'm trying to say. And this one, unlike Flea, which we saw earlier this week, or Summer of Soul, are both narrative-driven. There's a story to be told here about what happened. This one is very much thesis-based. There's the thesis that America, while achieving great things, has this incredibly racist undercurrent through its history that has been consistently trying to keep black people down. That's the thesis of this documentary. When you watch Flea, there is no thesis to Flea. Flea is this guy's story as he tries to leave Afghanistan as a refugee, then goes to Russia, then goes to Denmark. There is no thesis there where it's this is why X is wrong. Topics like that will be addressed, and you'll be able to see and make judgments for yourself as it's portrayed there by the people who are involved. But it's not, I'm going to prove this through X, Y, and Z. Really, it's closer to the DBQ, the document-based question, because we're actually citing things and not just, write anything. And what this one does is it lays out that thesis. So I'm not gonna sit here and dissect every plot point or every point in the movie that he makes and be like, well, he says this, then this, and you can counter with this. I don't want to be the guy who's gonna go here down the line and break down every point. There's gonna be some asshole who's gonna do that. And instead of being like, well, he laid out all this stuff, but have you considered this instead? And it's stuff that's completely out of left field, that has nothing to do with it. There are going to be assholes who do that. That's not my job. When you talk about a movie like this, you got to put politics aside and your personal opinion and about, people involved and everything like that, and where they may lean on the political, spectrum. But what you need to look at is, what's their thesis? How well do they back up their thesis? And do they succeed in proving their thesis? Or making a strong enough claim for their thesis? And because Jeffrey, the narrator, was a lawyer and he worked for the ACLU, he does a pretty good job of setting up a thesis, laying out evidence for his thesis, and then closing his thesis. That's what he does. That's his job. So he does that pretty well in this. think that, I'm going to talk about it from the technical standpoint. How well done is it? How well is, all of that? And I do have, like, it's a minor thing, but it's not major. I'm not a fan. It works a little bit better here than, say, Michael Moore's documentaries, like Bowling for Columbine, or Capitalism: A Love Story, or Fahrenheit 11/9, or any of those, where, the narrator, I don't want the narrator in it as much when they're doing, like, on-location things. I'm just a bigger proponent of just letting the person speak for themselves, the person they're interviewing, rather than getting the question too. It's a point of personal preference more than it is a point of, like, a cinematic standard when it comes to it. It's kind of like people who saw Don't Look Up and didn't like the cross-cutting. Like, for me, didn't bother me that much, but there were people who, they don't like how cross-cutting feels from a pacing standpoint. So for me it was fine, but for some people they didn't like that. Same way, I'm not a big fan of the interviewer being on camera. I'm a bigger fan of the interviewer being off camera and not being directly involved in the proceedings. Because the thing is, it's like we're not, like here it's different, because here it's his testimonies of him eliciting the answers a little bit different than, say, Michael Moore, who's just on these, diatribes at times, about whatever he's trying to prove. But I would prefer less of, like, in those scenes, because we get him constantly throughout the stuff, and I feel like there was one toward the end where he goes back to his family home and he tells his story. That's different. But when it comes down to, like, him interviewing one of the last survivors from the Tulsa Race Massacre and things like that, I don't need him there. She can speak for herself. And him being there doesn't add anything to it, I don't think. It's a small complaint, and it doesn't, hurt anyone to have it there or not have it there. But it's just something that, I won't say I bumped into it, but it's just a point of personal preference when it comes to documentaries of this style. He is really good, though. I forgot his last name, but Jeffrey's his first name, and he is really, really good at asking interview questions, keeping you engaged, and doing, his speech. That's basically what it is. I don't want to say it's a TED Talk, because that's kind of what it is, but at this point, saying it's a TED Talk feels a little bit, not derogatory, but, like, almost dismissive of what it is. Like, but that's basically what it is. He's up in front of an audience of people, and he's talking about, He's talking about, a topic at length, and that's a cool, important thing to do, and he uses visual aids. It feels a little bit like Robert Wool had a documentary thing on HBO, like Assume the Position, where it's like we're going to use visual aids, stuff like that. It feels a little bit like that, but, this is substantially better by a large margin than Assume the Position. I also think there is the way he lays it out, too, is interesting, where instead of being like, when we think of state your thesis in the beginning, as one would if they were writing an essay or if they were writing a dissertation or something, he lays his thesis out as he goes. You can extrapolate what the thesis is, and he never really outright says it until the very end, where he talks about tipping points in American society, and how tipping points are these, inflection points, I guess is another way to say the same thing, around which, we feel like race relations are getting to a point where things could get better. And then right when they get to the top of the mountain, where he uses like a bell curve design for it, you get to the ball to the top of the mountain, and right when they get to that top of that mountain, something happens, and the ball goes back down the hill. And that's what he lays out throughout the movie, is that, like, look, things are getting better, things are getting better, things are getting better, then things are getting to the best point, and then they get pushed back. They get pushed back down the hill. Things are getting better, getting better, getting better, getting better, and then gets pushed back down the hill. And then he points out, like, we are at the top of the hill right now. We are at the point where, this is where we have to, decide, what are we going to do? Are we going to, allow ourselves to fall back down, or are we going to push forward and make this happen? And he lays out his argument through, like, historical, documents and historical statements and things like that. And it's really great. It's one of those things that it does a great job of deconstructing a lot of the arguments that people make about the Civil War and about the role of slavery in American culture and all of that, where it's like, he doesn't do it where it's like, fact or fiction, where he's like, here's a myth and we're going to dispel it. It's like, he goes through American history and talks about people now and connects it there. And all of that. And I think that, does a very good job. Another minor gripe I have is how it relates to the modern day, which is ultimately what the thesis is how does all of this stuff that happened in the past relate to now? That last segment, I think, is a little lacking. The connective tissue in the end of, like, here's all the historical evidence. That's all very strong. And, like, here's excerpts from the Constitution. Here's excerpts from statements. Here's a statement from, from Andrew Jackson in a newspaper in 1804. Here's something here's another, a verse from from the Star Spangled Banner that you've probably never heard before. Here is, something else, and here's something else, and here's something else, and he just lays it all out. But then there's the connective, there's like that last piece of connective tissue, where it's like, he talks about the crime bill in 1994, he talks about the, Nixon's war on drugs, all of that stuff he talks about. And he talks about, like, when we hear now, this is something that I think was very powerful, that we hear now about, the war on drugs as it relates to the opioid epidemic, with white children. He says, well, where was that same concern when it was black children? And I think that was a very powerful moment in this. And like how it relates to now, I think is really, like, it's one of those things where let me how do I put this correctly? Because, like, it's there and you can see it. And if you're someone who is going to see this documentary in theaters, odds are politically you align with a lot of what is being said in this documentary. It's not likely to change someone else's, like, no one is going to go to this movie in a theater and be like, I'm a little on the fence about this. Let me see if this movie can change my mind. That's not going to happen. That's not what this movie is for. In theaters. It will eventually go to, like, Hulu or something like that, and then people will watch it there. But, for right now, where it is, this is what it's doing. I think the problem is, if someone's watching this, and they are firmly ensconced in the belief, or entrenched in the belief, I don't think ensconced is the word, entrenched in the belief that these things happened in the past, and that was 50 years ago, that was 60 years ago, that was 100 years ago, that was 200 years ago, and all of that. There's not enough explicitly laid out by the end that says, yeah, that was that long ago, but here's how that leads to now. Here's how these things that happened then lead to now. And I think if you're going to change minds, and if you're going to do that, I would put a little bit more there. That's not to say that it doesn't do a good job of doing that. If you're someone who already has an idea of what this is, you're not going to feel like it's not well explained. If you're someone who's, if you're someone that they want their mind changed on, it's not going to, I don't think it's going to hit that tipping point, I guess, is the word I would use. Like, you're not, like, that's the thing, is the bootstrap argument that he talks about in the movie, or in the documentary, he refers to the bootstrap argument. There's no point where it moves past the then into the now in a real way that's going to change someone's mind. And I think that's a fundamental issue that this documentary has. It is really good, though. It's very well done. There's a lot of really interesting information that I did not know, and I studied political science in college, and my minor was American history. There are things that I didn't know that were taught here, and I learned. I left leaving something like the fact that they're written into the Constitution was the fact that they would not abolish slavery until 1808. Like there's a lot of things in this documentary I didn't know, and it does a great job of teaching these things. It's just not going to change minds of anyone who, is somewhat on the fence, if not on the other side of the political spectrum. That's not to say it's a bad documentary. It's good and it does its job, but at the same time, it's not going to change anyone's minds. That said, you should definitely go out and see it if it's playing in your market. It is very interesting. It's like 2 hours long, but it doesn't feel it, and that's, I think, the ultimate case of a good documentary for me in terms of pacing, is the fact that I can sit there for 2 hours and not feel like I sat there for 2 hours. Until I walked out, I'm like, holy shit, it's night. But yeah, definitely check this out. It's Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America. It is definitely worth your time to watch. I don't know if it's going to streaming anytime soon, but it is in theaters. I saw it in an empty theater, which was to be expected. But, definitely worth seeing. So we'll wrap up there for today. We will be seeing Book of Boba Fett finale this week. We will be seeing the 7th episode of Peacemaker. We will be seeing Death on the Nile on Friday. The very white Death on the Nile on Friday. So until then, have a great rest of your week.